Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and well, this is the Dunu Talos. This is coming in at around 200 bucks, and it's the latest planar IM to enter the Super Review studio and possibly the last of the year. So I recently just reviewed the Moondrop Stellaris, and I was really hopeful that that would be kind of my ideal planar, a mid-range focused tune in a shell that I like the look of it. But unfortunately, in case you missed that review, spoiler, I didn't love the Stellaris. But enter the Dunu Talos. This is the last attempt for the year to be what I want in a planar, which is again, a mid-range focused tune with the technicalities of a planar and a design that I love. And I'll be honest up front, I love the design of this thing. So for this past couple of weeks, I've been living with the Talos, comparing it with some other IMs that I like in its price range, as well as outside a little bit. And we'll talk about how those things stack up today. So like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're here now live, how's it going? Happy Sunday. Stick around to the end of the review. I will spend some time, some quality time with the chat, doing a little bit of a live Q&A. And if you've got any questions about the Talos that I don't answer here in the review, that'll be your chance to ask it. Otherwise, if you want to support the channel, I actually recommend joining my Discord server, which I've got linked in the description down below. There are premium memberships now in Discord that allow you to access special sections of the Discord chat, as well as access my writings, my notes, my listening notes ahead of my reviews. So that's a little bit of a pro tip for folks. But otherwise, shout out to Dunu for sending in the Talos for review. I do have them linked in the description down below if you want to check out Dunu. And with that out of the way, let's jump to the table and start talking about the physical stuff on the Talos. Like I typically do, we're going to talk about what's in the box, what I like about the physical stuff. Then we'll get into talking about the sound signature, what I like about the sound, what I maybe don't like about the sound, and then we'll get into how it compares to some competitors that I happen to have on hand. So for starters, what comes inside the box? First of all, pretty nice, simple, handsome packaging there. One thing that I was actually really excited to see was that Dunu includes this case, which I don't know, maybe it doesn't seem like anything special, but I really like these Dunu cases. I think it's just kind of like the right size for, you know, having plenty of room for your IMs and your accessories and stuff in there, but also still being pocketable. And, you know, it's got a nice zipper. And I guess I also kind of like the aesthetic on there. Other than that, you get a couple of, you know, basic accessories, including a cleaning brush, as well as a 3.5 millimeter to 6.3 millimeter adapter. Not a big thing I use for my IMs, but if you're hooking it up to a big amp, I suppose you've got that option. And then other than that, they also include 3 different styles of ear tips, which I'll pull in here real quickly and I'll comment on them. I will say, so this style right here, Dunu has been using for a while. I actually really like the shape of these, but the quality on the silicone is a little bit on the stiff and lacks a bit of grippiness to them. So I don't tend to use these very much, although again, I do like the shape of them. They've also included this set, which I think these are probably the best tips that Dunu's included in a while. This is kind of a new style that they started doing with, I believe, the Titan S. And it's got just a little bit of extra grippiness to it, a little bit more pliable, but also kind of got a similar dome to it. And then finally, we've got these new ones, which I mistakenly called macaroni tips. Someone in the Discord chat corrected me. It's not macaroni that these things are modeled after. It's a ditalini, something like that. We're going to call them the Dunulinis. But these are a new style tip that is, as you can see, cylindrical. Kind of surprisingly a little strange, to be honest. I tried them out. They worked fine. You'll notice I'm not using them on this IM. They were fine tips. I think all 3 of these are honestly decent tips, and it's nice to have a selection to find out what works best for your ear. I like to optimize, and I ended up trying out spin fits, which is what I've got on here at the moment. But I don't know, pretty nice selection of tips, of course. And then that leads us into talking about the IM and the cable that it comes on. So it'll lead us into talking about the build quality here on the Dunu Talos. So for starters, this cable, Dunu is obviously, or maybe not obvious if you're somewhat new to this channel, but Dunu is known for making really pretty standout cables. And in my opinion, this is as excellent as all their other cables. It's just got a nice balance of thickness to it, like a nice, it's a little bit on the thick side, but it's not too chonky and it's not too heavyweight. Like it's just a really, and I think it's also really attractive. I like the finish that they've chosen on this thing. It's not maybe the softest, most supple cable. You can kind of see that it's got a little bit of a bounce and springiness to it, but I really don't have any complaints about that. Like in terms of the way that it handles and really wraps back together, this is a pretty excellent IM cable. The one thing maybe worth calling out, if you are used to Dunu's other cables, a lot of the times they include like these swappable terminations that allow you to turn a 3.5 into a 2.5 or a 4.4 millimeter termination. They don't include that on this cable. Not a big deal for me because I always use 3.5 anyway, but if you are a balanced cable user, just a heads up that you shouldn't expect Dunu's typical swappable terminations there. Apart from that, I mean, let's see. It's got nice looking hardware, and of course you've got your preformed ear hooks up top, and then you've also got a 2-pin connector. Pretty typical and pretty standard. So otherwise, that will lead us into talking about the earpieces themselves, which I gotta say are, I think, very handsome. And that's not something I've said of, I think, any other planar IM. I'm pretty picky about aesthetic when it comes to IMs, and if you've seen my other reviews of things like the Timeless, the S12 and the Rapto hook and stuff like that, like they're very good sounding IMs, but I don't love the aesthetic of them. The Dunu Talos, however, I love the aesthetic of this thing. I think it's really good looking. It's got kind of like this matte black finish to it, and it is an all metal shell. It might look a little bit plastic or something, but it is definitely an all metal shell with a decent bit of weight to it. But I really like that matte finish to it with the subtle gold accents. Gives it kind of a sense of luxury. Not that I don't know, maybe I am a luxury kind of guy, but it feels really nice. And then maybe even more beyond it feeling nice, I think the ergonomics here on the Dunu Talos are a little bit better than some of your other planar IMs. Well, for starters, the earpieces are a little bit smaller than some of the others. Like, it is still just kind of like a round circle, but these are smaller than something like the Lecture S12, the Rapto hook, or the Timeless. But apart from just being a little bit smaller, I think that the way that it fits into my ear is actually probably the best of all of the planars. You can see it plugs in there. I would describe the size as medium. You know, I say it's smaller than the other planars because they're all a little bit on the large side. This is very much squarely a medium-sized ear tip or earphone. Now, it doesn't have like any wings or anything like that, so it's not going to like lock into place into the folds of my ear or anything like that, but it does have a relatively long nozzle, not especially long, but long enough that it gets past the folds and reaches into my ear canal and gets a decent grip. Now, again, kind of like some other IMs, the Moondrop Stellaris is similar. It does basically rely on your ear canal for all the support, but generally, because of the weight of these things, they're lighter than something like the Stellaris. I really had no issue with these things staying in place in my ear, and overall just pretty satisfied with the physical stuff here on the Talos. Again, the ergonomics, I would say ingress, egress, good. Comfort, good, no sharp edges or anything like that. And then fit security, I would say, is average, but it's not bad like it is on pretty much most of these other planars, or at least a little bit below average. So yeah, that is the physical stuff. I think that is as much as I wanted to say. Let me check my notes briefly while I rotary wrap these back together. And again, you can see like how attractive and tidy they wrap up. But yeah, let's talk about now the sound here. And like I typically do, we'll talk about we'll start by talking about the sound signature here on the Dunu Talos. So, and I'll just maybe I'll preface this up front, like most of the early planars that came out were all kind of versions of a mild V-shaped sound signature. And then the planars that have come out recently are more mid-range focused. And that is also true here of the Dunu Talos. I would describe this sound signature as overall a lean neutral tune. It does have some sub-bass emphasis that gives it a decent amount of dig in the sub-bass frequencies, but it is light on mid-bass. And because of that, the mid-range comes forward. In fact, I would say that there is a little bit more than average vocal emphasis on this. It pulls those vocals really forward in the mix. And like pretty much all the other planars, the treble is beyond well extended here. There is ample treble extension here, and it's not like an especially bright tune. But there is more treble extension here than is what I would say neutral. So that's your basic tune, a lean neutral with sub-bass extension, treble extension, but mostly you're talking about a mid-range focused sound signature. Now, one thing that is worth calling out is that, and I haven't talked about this before now, but there is a switch on these things, which changes the tuning of that sound signature that I just described. In fact, that switch makes these a hybrid IM. There's not only a planar in here, there's also a balanced armature. And flipping that switch engages the balanced armature. I think you should pretty much ignore that feature, okay? That switch, when you turn that thing on, it just adds inexplicable amounts of treble to the sound signature. It completely spoils the timbre of things like hi-hats. It even introduces sibilance to vocals where I was not getting sibilance before. In my opinion, that switch, you should just pretend that switch does not exist. Ignore it, not worth listening to. This is a planar IM. Be satisfied with that. Okay, so that's just the general sound signature. Now let's talk about what do I like about the sound here on the Dunu Talos. Okay, and similar to some of those other planars that I've talked about, there's a lot in common here with the Talos and good attributes, right? So that treble extension that I talked about, again, you could probably describe it as overperformant. That was a nice euphemism that I learned at CanJam this year. It's a little overperformant, which means it's maybe a little bit exaggerated, but it does give you a nice sense of air. And honestly, like, it's better to have, I think, a little bit too much treble extension than not enough, because what you do get is you get nice timbre on high frequency percussion. So things like hi-hats, drum brushes, cymbals and stuff like that, they all sound like natural, and you get like the full body and decay of them with nice treble extension that you get on the planars, and the Talos here is no exception. I think it also gives it just kind of an overall sense of a nice sense of micro contrast throughout the sound signature and really throughout the mid-range. So I really like that. All right, and then talking about the mid-range, I think you can really appreciate the mid-range on this set because of the lack of mid-bass bloat. Okay, I've talked about the earlier planar IMs, the Timeless, the S12, the Rapto Hook, the Tin Hi-Fi P1 Max. Those are all a little bit bloaty in the mid-bass, which they're not bad, but they are a little bit bloaty, which just means that the mid-range kind of gets sacrificed a little bit. Here with the Talos, you get that mid-bass is kind of tucked away, and the mid-range is allowed to come forward and really be able to appreciate, again, all of that kind of micro contrast and texture that I like. So that's generally what I like here about the Talos. A lot to like about it, but of course I'm gonna have some nitpicks. So what are the things that I don't love about the sound? I mean, I will say that tonal balance that I described is a bit thin. It's very similar to the 7 Hertz Dioko that I reviewed earlier. In fact, it's got a lot in common with the Dioko in terms of sound signature, but it comes across a little bit thin and a little bit weightless in that mid bass. So while I just praised that mid bass tuck, I do wish that maybe we had somewhere of a bit of a happy medium between this bass and the bass on something like the Rapto Hook. That would probably be perfect. But as it is, this one just kind of comes in a little bit thin. I would say it's not as thin sounding as something like the Moondrop Stellaris, but it does lack a bit of body to the sound signature. And just broadly, I think that this thing could actually use a bit more bass. Sometimes it felt like I actually wasn't getting a good seal with the fit, and then I would unplug them from my ears, plug them in, make sure I was getting a good seal, and kind of realize that it wasn't the seal that was the issue. It's just the fact that this thing is really pretty thin and pretty light on mid bass. And then the other thing that I will call out now, we'll talk about this more as we get into the comparisons, but I do think that versus some of the other planars, look, the planar IMs in general are kind of becoming known for their technical performance. And this one does excel in a lot of ways that those other planars do, but I do think that versus some of those more V-shaped sounding planars, the Talos does come across with lacking a bit of incisiveness to its sound signature, right? So despite it being somewhat of a bright tune, I think the treble here on the Talos lacks a bit of that bite. It's kind of similar to the Moondrop Stellaris in a way. And then similarly, I think that the bass attack can kind of be a little bit soft and a little bit undefined. It's not smeary or bloaty or bleedy or anything like that. It's just, it lacks that incisive edge that, I don't know, I think usually can make the things like imaging and stuff like that really stand out. So those are my general thoughts here on the Dunu Talos, but like I mentioned, I do want to put it into context by comparing it to a couple of other IMs. So while I stall and try to move away these myriad tips away from the camera angle. All right, there we go. Let's pull in some other competitors that we will talk about how they stack up directly here with the Dunu Talos. All right, and we've got kind of a range of IMs here that cover a decent range of price, but also drivers. So, of course, we've got the Dunu Talos coming in at $200, and technically it's a hybrid, but again, I would really just think of this as a planar IM. We've also got over here, this is the 7 Hertz Talos, also a single planar IM, coming in at half the price. This one's $100, and we'll talk about why this one's on the table and why it makes sense that this one's on the table, despite that very significant price gap. Here we've got the Rapto Hook X, also a planar IM, and I guess also technically a hybrid. They've got like some sort of piezo driver in there. I don't know that it's doing anything necessarily. Again, I kind of just think of this one as a single planar IM anyway, but I think this one comes in at $240. And then finally, we've got the Moondrop KATO, which I brought this one in because, well, this is a dynamic driver. So it's pretty different from the others in terms of its driver configuration, but price-wise, it's $190. So very, very close to the Dunu Talos. And I wanted to just make sure that we had something in the same price range so you kind of have in context, as I'm saying, these pluses and minuses, how much of it is due to price and how much of it is, you know, just something that's unique to these IMs. So there you go. That's just to set the general stage. Let's start by differentiating them on sound signature. The Dunu Talos, we just got done talking about this. I would say, again, kind of like a thin, lean neutral. It's light on meat. It doesn't have a lot of mid-bass body. It does have very forward vocals. And like most of the planars, pretty much all the planars, it's got very, very well extended treble. Most of that you could also say here about the Sound Notes Dioko, their 7 Hertz Sound Notes Dioko. Again, I think this is also a very thin, kind of lean neutral versus the Talos. This one actually comes across to my ear a little bit brighter, but frankly, these are much more similar than different when it comes to the tonal balance. The Rapto Hook is going to be a little bit different here. This one's more of like a mild V-shaped sound signature. You get a lot more, quite a bit more mid-bass body on it, mid-bass meat, and similarly you get that nice treble extension with, you know, a decent amount of vocal forwardness, but it's going to be a little bit, it's going to be quite a bit less vocal forward than these two sets. And then finally, we'll talk about the Moondrop KATO, which sound signature wise, I would say is also kind of a mild V-shaped sound signature, also has a bit more of that mid-bass meat to it. Similar to this sound signature here on the Rapto Hook. And yeah, the treble is not quite as well extended here on the KATO, but we'll talk about that more as we get into the technicalities, which I guess is a good segue into us now talking about the technicalities, technical performance. Okay. The Dunu Talos, in terms of technical performance, I would actually say is of the bunch, the softest of the bunch, right? I was talking about that incisiveness that this set lacks, and when you're listening to it in comparison to these 3 other sets is where it really kind of comes across. It does lack a bit of incisiveness, and I think the bass attack here on the Talos is very soft and just kind of undefined. That said, I mean, you do still get that nice treble air, good timbre with high frequency percussion, which is a thing that not a lot of IMs do that well. And it is good to get that here. It's just, it's not going to blow you away in terms of imaging performance or anything like that. The Dioko, in contrast, I actually think is a better technical performer than the Dunu Talos, and at half the cost. And because of that, I think it's, you know, very competitive with the other sets here that are on the table. I think you get a better sense of that incisiveness in the treble, which gives it a better sense of definition on like the leading edge of instruments, guitar poles and stuff like that. They just sound a little bit better defined. And even the bass hits, while this is also not a bassy set, neither of these are very bassy, the bass hits, because of that added incisiveness, I think actually contributes to a better sense of physicality in that bass. And then I think, like the Talos, you know, you still get that really good sense of mid-range detail here in the oh my gosh, the Dioko. Blank there for a second. But I think you also get a little bit better sense of imaging in this set. Let's talk about the Rapto Hook now, how this one compares. And again, tonally, this one's different, so that's probably going to be the bigger difference between the Dioko and the Rapto hook is going to be more the tonal balance, more so than the technical performance. But I do think that the technical performance on the Rapto is probably the best of the bunch, at least in certain ways. It is the most impressive of the planars, in my opinion. It gives you a really nice sense of that incisive treble, gives you an excellent sense of mid-range detail, and I think the bass on the set is actually pretty good. It's not the best bass, it's not the best DD bass, but it's pretty good. Maybe a little bit bloomy, but generally for planar bass, I think this is the best. And then finally, the Moondrop KATO technical performance. This set is where, okay, I was just talking about this bass being the best of the planars. This is ideal bass, in my opinion. One of the best dynamic driver basses I've heard in an IM, and you get it for around 200 bucks, which is pretty nice. It's just really tight, punchy, gives you a nice sense of physicality to it. And then on top of that, I think the treble on the KATO actually has a really nice sense of incisiveness too, which gives okay, it does give up a little bit of that upper treble resolution to the planars, but that added incisiveness here does, I think, actually bring the KATO into competitive landscape here. It just gives it a better sense of definition. Again, like things like those guitar plucks, the vocal definition especially, and stuff like that. I think the KATO is really pretty standout in terms of technical performance. And then finally, we'll talk about how these things are in terms of form factor. Here's where we'll, bother zooming in on them so we can talk about them. I think the Talos is a very handsome IM, has also a great cable. Ergonomics, I would say, are pretty decent. I would say of the bunch, this is my favorite in terms of the physical form. Next up would be the sound notes, the 7 Hz sound notes, Dioko. This is on the other end, kind of like my least favorite. It just aesthetically, it's not my bag. Maybe you like it. I think it looks kind of bad. The cable is, fortunately, maybe also not the most attractive, but it's actually a really well-behaved cable. And then the fit, I would say, is actually surprisingly better than you might think. These earpieces, they appear kind of large and maybe a little bit oddly shaped, but I actually found that the fit securityness was decent, probably about on par with the Talos. The Rapto hook, let's talk about this one form factor wise. I think aesthetically it's really kind of plain and ordinary, but for the green, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the green highlights. It's probably being pretty picky, but otherwise it's a decent looking IM, if a little bit plain, and I don't know. It looks a bit OEM, but it is a decent build quality, and all metal shells. So build quality wise, it doesn't really lack anything. It's just a little meh to look at. And then fit security, I would say here on the Rapto hook is a little bit worse than it is on the other two that we just talked about. And then finally, the Moondrop KATO. I think this is a really handsome looking IM. If you're into bling, this is pretty bling without being gaudy like the Dioko. Just nice looking shells. It's also got a very good cable, maybe a little bit on the thick side. Some people have complained about that. It doesn't bother me. I actually really like it. And then fit security on this, I would say, is maybe a little bit better than some of the planars, but I don't know. It's about on par, to be honest. So I think, folks, that's about going to do it for my thoughts here on the Dunu Talos. I do, of course, have to give it a score out of 5 stars. I'm going to give the Dunu Talos a very solid 4 stars. I think physical form factor wise, this is by far my favorite of the planar IMs out there. I think it just looks handsome, it fits me well, and then of course it's got a Dunu cable on it, which I'm a big fan of. Sound signature wise, I like that it's mid-range focused. It just, unfortunately, it lacks a bit of incisiveness, and it's unfortunate, especially in contrast to the 7 Hz Dioko, which comes in at half the price. And I think the Dioko actually sounds more technical than this set, despite having a very, very similar frequency response. So those are my thoughts here on the Talos. If you're interested in checking this out, I do have it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this video helpful, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and join the Discord server where you can support me and hang out with a bunch of other pretty cool people in the audio community. If you're here live now, stick around, we'll have a chat. Otherwise, I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.